Hello, everybody. Um, Go ahead and get started now. If you've been following along, welcome back to Chaos to Clarity, AI for Manufacturers. If you're joining us for the first time, we're glad you're here. And let me just give you a quick recap of what this series is about. So we started by talking about a simple question. What is AI and how can I apply it in a repeatable way to real business problems? And to answer that, we looked at the build framework, which gives you a structured way to think about using AI in your operations. So from there, we moved into what an AI platform might look like, specifically the Rover AI platform, where your data is tightly integrated with AI and the kind of business value that level of integration can unlock. So today is about moving from AI assistants to AI agents. And most of us are familiar with the first category. With an assistant, you ask a question, it gives you an answer. And that's the classic AI chat experience. It's helpful, but can be limited because even if the answer is great, you still have to take action on that answer. So you still have to log into a system, pull a report, update a record, create a quote, whatever that next step is in your process. So what we're focusing on today is kind of that next evolution. Instead of just answering questions, can actually take action on your behalf. And that's what we mean by an AI agent. So an AI agent doesn't just say, here's what you should do. It says, here's what you should do, and I've already started doing it. So, imagine a few examples here. Instead of just asking what orders are at risk of shipping late, an agent could find those orders, notify the right people, and maybe create tasks in your ERP. Or instead of what's our scrap rate this week, an agent could pull that data, create a short summary, and email it to your production supervisors. So that shift from information to action is where a lot of the real business value starts to show up. So today we'll do two things. Very briefly define what an AI agent is, a little more deep, and why it matters for your business. And then we'll jump onto the Rover AI platform and actually see some of these agents in action. And really excited to share that piece with you. So before we really get started here, I do want to just take a minute to introduce myself and Mike. My name's Tyler Hansen. I'm an implementation consultant here at Zoom Assist. And before this role, I was director of technology for a plumbing and HVAC distribution company. And in that role, I really had a chance to apply AI to real business problems and, see some measurable results from those tools in day-to-day operations. And joining me today is Mike Wright, CTO here at Zoom Assist. And Mike will be keeping an eye on chat, answering any questions in there, and jumping in to help answer any questions that get a little more technical. So with introductions out of the way, let's go ahead and get started here. So I wanted to kind of connect this idea of an AI agent to something that's pretty familiar in manufacturing, the first CNC machine. So if you go back to the 1940s, machining was still very manual. And then you get this guy, his name was John T. Parsons. He was working on helicopter rotor blades. And he was trying to machine these really complex curved shapes. And doing it by hand was slow and inconsistent. So Parsons and his team started using punched card calculators to generate these positions for a milling machine. And then operators would literally read numbers off of a printout and move the machine by the numbers to each point. So it was clunky, but it proved a big idea that you could drive a machine tool from numerical instructions instead of hand wheels. And the US Air Force saw the potential here and funded MIT to take that concept all the way. So in 1952, and the picture of the machine is actually here on this slide, MIT's lab retrofitted a Cincinnati hydrotel milling machine with motors on each axis and a controller the size of a room, driven by punch tape. So for the first time, a milling machine could follow a programmed toolpath and cut these complex 3D parts automatically with really high precision. And that prototype became the foundation for modern CNC machining. And that was a step change. Machinists didn't disappear, but their work shifted from turning handles all day to designing and programming and supervising this process. And I think we're at a really similar moment now with AI agents, but in the business world. So over the last few decades, most companies have already gone through kind of their own pre-CNC waves of business automation. We've digitized processes with ERP systems. We've added workflows and scheduled jobs to automate those kind of fixed, repeatable steps. And we've layered on dashboards and BI tools so we could see what was happening. And all of that has delivered very real efficiency. But if you look at how work actually gets done today, there's still a very familiar pattern. Our systems can store the data. Our systems can display the data. But a lot of the times it's still people who have to log in, look at those reports, figure out what needs attention, and then manually take action. So that bottleneck is kind of the office version of standing at a manual mill all day, turning the handles yourself. And what's emerging now with AI agents is kind of that next leap. So instead of tools that just say, here's your data, good luck, we're moving towards systems that can say, here's what's going wrong, here's what should happen next, and I've already started taking those steps for you. So again, they don't remove people from the loop, just like CNC didn't remove machinists. They shift you from humans manually turning the handles to humans designing, supervising, and improving the processes that these digital workers or agents are running every day. So it's about putting intelligence in that flow of work so actions can happen consistently, not just when somebody has time. So again, just like that first CNC machine was a leap from manual machining to this programmable machining, I really think that AI agents are a leap from manual action taking to this more intelligent, automated process. Think about how many times a day someone on your team answers the same question, approves the same type of request, or is copying data from one system to another. And none of that is strategic, but it's eating up hours every single week. And it's the same kind of work over and over again. So on top of this, a lot of our systems are operating a little disconnected. So your CRM knows one thing, your ERP knows another, and they don't naturally talk to each other. So people become this kind of middle layer, manually stitching everything together just to get a complete picture before they can even decide what to do. And then we have customer expectations that are really outpacing execution speed. So most of our customers today are used to instant experiences. They can track a package in real time, get answers from a chat in seconds, and then they email our team and wait 2 days for a reply because someone has to manually research that answer, check 3 different systems, and finally respond. So that gap between what customers expect and how fast we can respond manually is where a lot of that frustration starts to show up. You hire these great people to solve problems and build relationships and innovate, but a huge chunk of their day disappears into copy paste, lookups, status updates, and approvals. And it can really limit the impact that they're able to have on your business. So that's the reality that most of us are living into today, to a certain extent. So what might that look like in an agent-driven world? AI agents are interesting not because they give you more dashboards or more data, but because they can take action on that data. So instead of a person deciding the same thing over and over, you can apply those rules to an AI agent and that decision is made automatically, or it's proposed to a human to quickly approve. So agents don't care what screen the data lives on. They can pull information from your CRM, your ERP, and combine that into one coherent view. So instead of logging into 3 tools and having to stitch that together, the agent orchestrates the workflow end to end. And because agents are always on 24/7, they can watch for specific events and act immediately, whether that's updating an order, sending a notification, or answering a question. And that can really start to allow you to match the expectations that your customers are putting on you. And that's really the real payoff. So when agents handle the routine, your people get their time and attention back, and they can design better processes, experiment with new services, and improve the customer journey. So let's hop over now and actually look at some of these live. I know somebody already dropped that in the chat. You're wanting to see this in action, and I'm wanting to show you. So let's hop over there and give me 1 second here. Okay. So what I have here within the Rover AI platform is an agent orchestrator, basically. And I kind of wanted to tell a story with this so it's a little more relatable. So we're going to take kind of that outside salesperson persona. If you've ever done outside sales or are familiar, you kind of know the pain here. Updating the system of record while you're on the road can be a little tricky. You might have to pull over, fire up a hotspot, VPN into the network, log into the ERP or CRM, and fight with a small screen in a parking lot. So there's a lot of friction there. So what often happens in reality is the system doesn't get updated. The quote requests get scribbled into a notebook or stuck in someone's head, and sometimes it just gets forgotten. So let's look at what this could look like instead with an AI agent. So let's say we stop by a customer and we need to figure out when they're going to pay us. And Bob at 8X Systems tells us that he's going to pay us next week. So instead of having to go through all that and logging into the ERP, I can hop into this chat here and I can say, hey, talk to Bob today with 8X Systems. He's going to have a check to us early next week. And that agent is going to create that log for us. And I'll turn on the debug here for a second so you can kind of see what happened. And that's a really great thing about the Rover AI platform is there's an audit trail that you can look at when you're debugging these or kind of fine tuning them. So as we can see here, the agent looked at our customer data set, found the customer that is linked to 8X Systems, and then it created the log for us with the correct customer ID. So pretty cool to see that in action. And now let's say we're still at 8X Systems talking to Deborah in sales, and she wants a quote on a custom system. So from this same chat, you don't have to leave to a different screen. You can create a quote, or rather a quote request, because this is a custom system, really needs to go off to the inside sales team. So I'm going to drop this in here. Let's see. I come from the plumbing and HVAC world, so I'm going to say on a custom inline pump, needs it by tomorrow. And the agent takes that and creates a ticket or quote request in the ERP, routes it to inside sales. So as you can see here, there is actually a ticket created in the system that basically is a log for getting this quote request done. So the inside sales team can take it, get it done, and it's all tracked within the ERP. And we'll hop over to Rover Web to actually see what this is done on the back end in a second here. I just want to show you a couple of different examples to kind of give you an idea of the scope of this and how powerful it can be. So on to a next example here. We're going to stay with the same customer. Let's say you get a text from one of their sales people, and it's Mike, and he needs an order. He needs to get it coming. So I'm going to stick with HVAC here. Matchup. Okay, so what's going to happen here now is this agent orchestrator is going to basically call a product configurator that's going to get me the correct matchup based off of these criteria, and then it's going to return some options for me. And we'll see that in a second here. Okay, so we have 5 different options here. I want to go with option 3. So systems, and I don't want to give them any price breaks, so I'm going to go standard pricing. And it's going to call the agent here and create that quote and push it to the ERP. You can see it's making a couple different calls here. It's looking for the customer, it's finding the correct pricing record, and then it's creating the quote down here. Okay. And it should come back here with a little confirmation. And there we go. The order for 8X Systems has been successfully created. So really powerful to be doing all of this from a single screen. And to kind of demonstrate that, this doesn't need to be just Rover ERP that you're interacting with. This can be anything that has an API layer. So whether that's, like we mentioned earlier, a CRM or a sales tool, if it has an API, you can bring it onto this platform. So just an example of that here, I'm going to call a sales tool that we use. So I'm going to use myself as an example here. And there we go. So email gives me a title of implementation consultant, and you're good to go. So again, just imagine your outside sales rep, or maybe your accounts receivable, accounts payable, whatever role this may be, and they have an agent, and they're able to do kind of their entire workflow from a single screen. It's pretty cool. And just to kind of look under the hood here quick, I guess let me pause. Have there been any questions that have come up that need answering?
Nothing yet in chat, but this is a great spot to see if anybody has questions so far. Yeah.
Awesome. Great.
Show of hands. Anybody? Is all making sense? Or you're rushing to contact your account rep and see how you can get lined up with access in your BI tenant?
You should be. So we'll keep moving here, and if any questions pop up, we will definitely stop and answer them. But just to kind of give you a look under the hood here of how this is working. So I'm going to hit edit on this agent, and you'll notice the name here, agent orchestrator. So that name makes a little more sense when you hop in here and look at these assistants over here. So what is there? There's 5 assistants that are underneath this orchestrator. So you can kind of think of those as subagents. You have your orchestrator up top, or your manager, that is taking your request and it's deciding which agent it needs to call based on the different skills that are available to these agents. So, for example, with the things that we just ran through, we started with the log assistant, went to the ticket assistant, then this assistant did our matchup and our quote, and then this assistant was able to find my email. So that's kind of the orchestrator assistant. And then if we take a look at these individual assistants that the orchestrator has access to, we can kind of see how it starts to come together. So I'm going to hop into the AHRI assistant. And again, that's the one that's creating quotes and kind of acting as that product configurator. And you can see it has access to 3 different data sets here. So the first one is that product configurator data set, second, some customer information, and third, pricing. And then it has a skill down here. And what that skill is an API request. So this is where that tool calling comes into action. And you can give an assistant access to as many of these as you'd like. It is best practice, in my opinion, to break them down into subagents if you can. I think you get better results when doing that. But another really nice feature, a very necessary feature with Rover AI, is the ability to create a secret. And that's where you can put the API key. And API key is really just a way, kind of the keys to the door to talk with a particular system, for those of you that aren't familiar. And you can put that in here as a secret. And what that does is it hides it from being exposed to the web, essentially. So a really nice feature there to keep everything secure and keep everything locked away. So again, just as an overview here, you're creating subagents that each have specific tools and data sets they use to take action on certain types of requests. And then those subagents are living under kind of that manager that is routing each of these incoming requests to the right specialist. So again, when you combine all of that together, you end up with a really powerful modular agent system. You have a simple and conversational front end, and then underneath of that, you have these subagents using the right tools to provide those answers in just again, single screen. And not only that, a single screen that you can maybe pull up on your phone as an outside sales rep. So I use sales as the example because I think it's a good place to start. It can be a kind of a quick win place to start, but that's really just the surface of it. So kind of that point that I was touching on earlier, imagine one, let's go accounts receivable person, and they have their AR agent orchestrator. And underneath that orchestrator, they have maybe 10 or 15 subagents that are completing these different tasks that are relevant to their role. So you're essentially taking one person and giving them a 10 to 15x on productivity. And that can be very powerful. Mike, did you have anything that you wanted to add in on that respect?
Well, Stephen had a question in chat about how, just on the topic of giving them access to an API. And so I threw an explanation there. You hit it here. I want to make sure that makes sense. If there's any follow-up questions, this might be a good time to address them. And if we need a minute for a follow-up question, I would just make the point to part of the beauty and enabling the skills for an agent on an API basis is it also means you're not sitting there with an agent out of the box that has access to call every single API that your ERP might have, or it doesn't have access to go into every single data set that you give it access to from a knowledge perspective, with the potential to go change that information, right? That leveling up from what we talked about in the last webinar to where we're at here, where we view these as agents because you're empowering them with the ability to take access, that really happens on an as needed basis that you get to decide. Derek's got a question here about hallucination and mistakes. Yeah, if an agent puts bad data in, how can I know about it or confirm? That would go into the agent configuration here too, where you might say, hey, you need to ask me before you call this skill, right? Or call this API, right? So always be presenting this information back to me first. Now, do you have the potential for it to ignore that instruction? Totally. And so then it comes into what are the countermeasures you can do within your system just to help protect against that, which are effectively, the way we view it, the same as the countermeasures you'd use to protect against users putting bad data into the system, right? So if the SO.E, as an example, is already applying some validation to the record before it's able to be saved, because of how we've structured the APIs for Rover, that same validation is going to be applied against anything the assistant sends in, right? So you're not going to have the assistant pumping garbage data into the system that wouldn't be possible for a user to call up a form, whether it's a legacy form or Rover point of sale on the web, to create data in the system, right? That flaw is going to be more at the core level of the system versus a decision the assistant's making. But you could still have an assistant say, ooh, it created it for customer A when you wanted it for customer B or something, in the same way that a user might mix that up. And so some of that stuff ends up coming down to your own kind of audit and approval process flow internally to make sure you don't have users making the same mistakes. You get to that point where you still kind of need some last mile evaluation of things and the human in the loop in this way, versus a total blind trust of these things, right? But we view that as no different as life with users driving all of the processes. There is some level of needing to evaluate what they're doing, right? Yeah, and you can get into certainly agents that check other agents' work and everything, and you can really build up a whole complex pyramid or org chart of agents that are performing specific tasks. Because Tyler's point on making sure they have granular, narrow purposes is spot on. That also limits the ability or potential for them to hallucinate, right? If it has to decide how to translate your request, you asked for thing one, but it's got to figure out, is it right to call API 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5? That's a lot of decisioning it has to do, versus if it only knows how to call API 1, that's a lot tougher for it to mess up, right? Stephen, it looks like we got a question about connectors. I'm maybe confused at where the connector language is coming from here. So in our world, these are not connectors like what you might find on the OpenAI side. That's an entirely different beast. So this is different from that, if that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, and to touch on just the idea of having that human in the loop, I think that's another best practice for a lot of workflows, is to have that human in the loop, have the assistant basically reading back to you what it's going to do, and then you approving it. I do think that's a good practice too, especially when you're getting comfortable with these agents.
Tyler, did you want to pop into the web application real quick just to show people the data as it exists in the system, which all happened in real time after the assistant took that action for you. So we're coming to it a little later, but for those that aren't familiar, this is the Rover Business Suite web interface, which is available for Rover ERP users and people who are not running on Rover ERP, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So as you can see, I have run a few tests here, but this is the ticket that was just created over in the chat. So if I hop into that, I got a quote for 8X systems, custom inline pump, price and availability. So then somebody on the inside sales team, maybe that sets off an alert that, hey, new quote request came in. They can take care of that, and then they can close out that ticket. And again, it's all tracked in the system. Much better than ending up in a notebook in the outside sales pickup and probably getting forgotten about. It's pretty cool to have a system of record like that, so easily accessible. And we'll hop over to the orders here as well. So we'll take a look at this one. And this is going to be that system that we first selected with the product configurator and then ultimately pushed over to the system as an order. Might be because I have two of these open. We'll see. There we go. Okay, so as you can see, that's the stuff that was option 3 over on the other screen. Now it's here in an order, can be picked, got out the door. So, I mean, it's really a similar workflow, which is appealing as well to what your team is probably already doing. So your team is probably already texting a request to inside sales or emailing the request or maybe making a phone call. You're still doing that. You're just giving that request to the agent, which is then taking action immediately. So, yeah.
I think you had the contact log too, right? Only other thing.
Yeah, let's take a look here.
Natalie, we do have a recording of this, yeah, that we'll share out. Yeah, Derek, the chat upload access will be coming. So it doesn't exist right now for you to drop a file into the chat interface. That's the next major release has that, along with the ability to select other models that are not from OpenAI and the ability to schedule out tasks with an agent in the background. There's also a native Windows and iOS interface coming as a part of that release. That gives you a bit of a different UI into your BI tenant that centers around the assistants that you have created or the agents that you have created. You can still embed them in other things like we've done with the web application, with our support docs, stuff like that. And you can still access them through the web too, but another nice cool exposure point coming. I don't have an ETA on that release yet, but it is the next major release. Probably in Q1 at this point, given Q4 is so close to done. But yeah, if you were going to do something like that today, what you would end up doing is maybe emailing that PDF to a workflow management system like Zapier, and having it do the parsing and then interacting with your assistant, because it can make API calls to talk to assistants. That's actually how our help ticketing system works now, is it engages with our support assistant through API calls. That would be a path. Or the other path would be you could drop the PDF into like a OneDrive or Box or Google file share. And as long as you have that library linked in to your BI tenant, you can grant the assistant access to go look at files in there. So, but it is, who wants to do that? Like we see the value effectively in being able to drop files right into the chat interface too, instead of have to push them somewhere else and then have the assistant pick them up.
Yeah, and that's a really great thing about building these on the Rover AI platform too, is like Mike said, you have the ability to kind of bring these assistants out via API or iframe embedding into other systems if you need to. And that gets a little in the weeds, but I think it's a good thing to touch on. It's pretty powerful. So anything else you wanted to touch on the platform, Mike?
No, I think you hit it. Probably fine to go back to the slides and close them out.
Yeah.
And if we get any other questions along the way, we can spend some time on them.
Awesome. Okay. So just to clear up, some misconceptions or some things that you may have heard about AI agents. The best way to think about an AI agent, in my opinion, is augmentation, not replacement. So agents are very good at things like looking up information, applying rules consistently, moving data between systems, data entry, and doing all of that at machine speed. But humans, on the other hand, are good at building relationships, handling sensitive conversations, and making trade-offs that depend on values and not just data. So, and again, this is a opinion, but when we deploy agents well, I think they take the repetitive, low judgment tasks off your team's plate, so your people can spend more time on that creative, strategic work that you hired them for. So just something to keep in mind. And another thing that comes up sometimes is, is this just a glorified script or macro, or is this the same thing as robotic process automation? Those are powerful and they absolutely have their place, but they're also rigid. So if the screen changes or the data looks slightly different, they often break. And that's where agents are different because they can understand context. They can read an email or a ticket or a query in natural language, identify the intent, and adapt the workflow based on what's actually happening. So you can think of agents as kind of a next generation. So they're still reliable and rule driven, but far more flexible in real world scenarios where things don't always look exactly the same every time. So again, security, of course, a big concern, understandably so. And when people hear AI agent, sometimes they imagine them just doing whatever they want. And that is really not how production agents are designed, or at least that's not how they should be designed. In a well-built deployment, every agent is operating within clearly defined boundaries, following your business rules and policies, and you have an audit trail there to understand what it did and why when you're troubleshooting. So you have the control to specify which systems it's allowed to touch, which actions it's authorized to take, and maybe what dollar amounts or risk levels require a human check. So instead of being this unpredictable entity, an agent can become a little more controlled and just another component of your overall process.
Just another member of the organization, right? I think that's the key, because our recipe for this of leveraging the system for the API, or not for the AI to drive everything, right? That gives you exactly the same visibility that you have into its actions that you would otherwise have into another employee, right? It would be different if you were not going through the same channel for it to make updates in the system and stuff. You would have to take care to start to build the same audit trail capacities around it. But that's why we view the APIs as that core, like, must-have layer, right? It enables all of this to work beautifully so that you can have that, the security and the predictability and the accuracy and everything else that you want to come with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and to that point, it's not a black box. Transparency is critical, just as for any worker, even a digital worker or AI agents. So, you're able to see the inputs, the reasoning steps, the decisions it made, and, the actions or tools it executed with. So, and we've mentioned this a few times, but on top of that, you're able to insert that human in the loop if you want another level of security. That's a really great tool to use to keep that in check. So the bottom line is AI agents can be controlled, auditable, and task specific if you're building them on the right platform. And I hopped ahead a little bit to show you guys the agents. So we have gone over this slide pretty extensively within the platform itself. And I wanted to throw this slide up here. Just again, hopefully seeing these in action has gotten the gears turning. You're starting to think, what can I do in my business with these agents? But and we'll have a recording of this, but I want to throw this up here to give some more ideas. And truly, this can be applied to any sector of your business. It just takes starting and experimenting, and we're happy to help with that. It's I've said it before on the previous webinars, but it's really just about having that light bulb moment, and it's really a snowball from there. And it's exciting and fun to work through that process, and I'm happy to do it with any of you. So here, yeah, we will open up the floor for some more questions, or if Mike has anything else to add. But just thank you for tuning in to this webinar series, whether this was your first one, whether this was the third one, you've been following along the whole time. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to learn about this. I have a couple QR codes up there to follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube. The recording for this will be up on YouTube, so I would recommend checking that out. And don't hesitate to reach out with any questions you have. Seriously, I love this stuff. It's probably annoying to my friends and family. So if I can talk with you guys about it, that would be great. But yeah, and hope you all have a happy holiday as well. It looks like we got a couple more questions coming in there.
Yeah. So Cody's asking about built-in security mechanisms that we provide that aren't roll your own. I mean, Cody, if you haven't spent any time in BI yet, even before getting to the assistant layer, there's nothing that's happening in there without you granting access to individuals or teams. And you could blindly give someone access to everything as a super user, but generally the way access to data sources, data sets, dashboards, all that stuff is handled is at the granular level, right? So it's not federating any security that you've set up within AD, but it's giving you a capacity to create your security structure within your tenant based off of the needs for your organization. And so if that's your foundation at the BI level, once you're then adding in assistants, creating agents over here, stitching them together, the same holds true where you're managing out using the security parameters within your tenant, what they have access to and what they don't have access to, right? So you don't have to go look for another security package to bring into scope. You don't have to wire up skills to make calls into Office 365, like graph APIs or anything, unless you wanted to empower the assistant to be doing anything on the tenant side over there. Everything that's happening is happening just based off of the foundation that you already have in place. So if you found yourself in a scenario where you gave the assistant access to call an API for your system, and you found that it was calling other APIs from your system without having been granted access to it using the tool, that would really just be proving out that your system doesn't have anything protecting some unknown caller from accessing those APIs. right? That it's not really a flaw of the assistant at that level. It's more of a flaw of the APIs behind the scenes. Since you're running a Zoom Assist ERP, even though it's not Rover, and we're doing all of the API work through the gateway, you have the security measures of the API gateway standing in front of that to protect for that. But hopefully that helps explain things a little bit more. This is the value of building this stuff up on top of everything else and not treating it as a full-blown separate system, even though from an infrastructure perspective, it is decoupled. Hallucinations and agent flows, yeah, I mean, it's the thing where it's just going to come down to what you're asking the assistant to do as you're configuring it. Because we're not providing you a stock configuration of an assistant here. We help you roll your assistants. We can certainly seed assistants based off of ones we've created elsewhere, but your tenant doesn't come with a bunch of assistants empowered that you have to go tweak. So as long as you're not doing things like telling the assistant to go read data that it doesn't have access to or make calls to APIs that it doesn't have access to, as long as you're being clear in your instruction set, we're finding that hallucinations are really limited or non-existent there. Maybe it wasn't the case with the older OpenAI models, but as they've evolved, that's gotten a lot tighter. And the only time I'm seeing these assistants go off the rails is when you look at their instructions and they're legitimately being asked to go consider information that they just haven't been granted access to. And that's where they start to feel empowered to go make things up. So this does all ultimately require that you've got a subject matter expert who's going to own this stuff for you and setting it up for your organization, although we're happy to provide those services and work with the business users who maybe don't want to get that involved in the process.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why the build framework can be really helpful when you're prompting or when you're building your system prompt. So we touched on it pretty heavy in the first webinar, but prompting does make a difference. I don't know if I'd go as far as calling it prompt engineering, but it makes a difference. So that's where you can really take care of a lot of those hallucinations, like Mike was saying.
I liked one of the last slides you showed too, personally, just because the thing I remind people of is like, just because you can use AI to solve this problem doesn't always mean you should. And the simple example is like if you were, if you needed to build a calculator, right? You wouldn't build a calculator at this point with AI because that's a pretty straightforward solved software problem in terms of having a calculator available. And so there are some things to consider as you're looking at your organization and thinking about things you might want to automate and accelerate where, yes, you can be building agents to do these things, but there are scenarios that could be cheaper, faster, more economical, more predictable, when it is very formulaic, to have that codified instead, right? Those things, just because you can now be building assistants doesn't mean you stop doing the other things too, right? But to Tyler's point, code becomes brittle as time moves forward and circumstances for the business change, right? Especially for those of you running on, PIC systems that have been around for decades and decades and decades, and shop rules around management of the system or the way to write programs has evolved over the years and not necessarily been maintained. Those exposure points stay present, which is why it's just so important for us to have a shared core common API layer for interfacing with the system that we use for all this stuff, whether it's the web interfaces or assistants, or allowing third-party systems to push data into our systems. We want to know that it's taken the same path each time, just way more maintainable that way and controllable. Just a quick reminder, docs.zoomassist.com. I'll drop the link in chat. We have a support assistant embedded over there. So you can go there, pull up the chat interface and talk to it. It can't take any action against our systems. It's also been told not to do things like write code for you to help you build your own stuff. So there's been some limitations placed on its instruction set. But if you just wanted to see what does it look like to interact with one of these things, and it has access to all the raw documentation, that we have out there for Rover ERP. So it's the same assistant that will take a first look at any email that you happen to send to help@zoomassist.com and try to find an answer for you with some qualifiers around that, especially if you're coming from a system that's been heavily customized and documentation doesn't cover all of your customizations, right? But it's pretty slick to see how all that's come together, and you consider that with exactly what Tyler's shown here today, where you then maybe give one of those assistants access to go then take some other action in the system. We could give this assistant access to go create tickets for us based off of the prompts that it gets. We're choosing not to do that right now and let the ticket automation just happen through the email flow that's managed elsewhere. But that email flow, right, can still take advantage of the assistant. So the cool thing about it is you have a ton of power and optionality at your fingertips. And it's not just PowerPoint slides for us, right? We've got real world stuff that you can look at and that we can get you going with too. So.
Any other questions? Well, yeah, again, if any more questions pop up after we're offline here, feel free to reach out and happy to have a discussion around it. Let's see here. Do you recommend a dedicated SME to set up a customer security?
Yeah, I think you probably want to have IT involvement, and you might be that person, right? Where you're really looking at the knowledge that's being granted to the assistants and the API skills that are being granted to the assistants, and comfortable with the fact that this stuff is has the right controls around it, right? The knowledge ones are a good example to consider, because that's really to allow for the library linkage for knowledge to, say, like a Teams file site or SharePoint site or something like that. You effectively have to set up that app registration within your Office 365 tenant. And so you do need to be careful about how you credential that out to make sure you're not credentialing that app registration to have access to like every single file share within the organization, right? Because then you're creating an exposure point within the BI framework where someone could go start to link in libraries based off of that app registration and the OAuth exchange that they themselves don't have access to. So this is really going to be it's not a bad thing to have. If you can afford for it as an organization, I'd highly encourage it, because then that also gives you power, right, in that conversation, instead of being reliant on other people to make the right decisions, whether or not those people live inside your organization. The reality is also not every organization can take that kind of approach to it. But if it were me, yeah, I would want, and for us, certainly there is an IT component in managing this to make sure this is not just with the business users to go and do whatever they would like. So I think it makes total sense. Sorry to our business users who are listening in.
Yeah, great questions.
Cody, if you want to snag some time with me too, just because I know this is very exploratory for you guys at the moment, I'm also happy to spend some time with you separate from the webinars.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and great questions. And I think we have some pretty exciting stuff coming for 2026 too. So we'll be in touch.